Hello and welcome. I'm Reverend Langston-Daley, the Senior Program Leader for Justice Building at the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. I welcome you all this afternoon and thank you for joining us for UUSC's second webinar on Defying Hate, addressing hateful speech in our communities and schools. Our conversations are inspired by the moral courage of Reverend Waitzel and Martha Sharp as they defied hate and saved hundreds of lives in Nazi-occupied Europe. The Sharps went on to found UUSC, our mission to advance human rights through grassroots collaboration and to work toward a world free of oppression carries on their work. Today, our discussion centers on how we can help depolarize hate speech in communities and schools. From systemic anti-Black racism to xenophobia targeting refugees and immigrants, our society is becoming more and more polarized and divided. We've seen incidents of violence and hate crimes rise as public and political rhetoric using innuendo and caustic language give unspoken permission to some to use violence against those they don't understand or fear. We know, too, that citing facts is rarely an effective strategy on its own for changing hearts and minds, and that most people, ourselves included, hear only what confirms the lived narrative of one's own experience. To begin to truly break down the us versus them that is so pervasive in political thought today, we have to face our own ideas and assumptions about who they are. One starting point is recognizing that while racism and xenophobia are never okay, many people who express those views have underlying fears that are valid. The economic decline of the white working class has destabilized families and communities, but hate speech and aggressive and violent actions are not spontaneous expressions of fear and anger. They are carefully cultivated by both media and politicians whose rhetoric expands the notion of what is socially acceptable and deflects blame into marginalized groups like refugees and away from the economic 1%. A recent study shows that at the national level, reported hate crimes against Muslim or those perceived to be Muslim increase and decrease significantly based on the tone of the US government's response, whether identifying Islam as a religion of peace not represented by the acts of terrorists, or by calling for a ban on all Muslims entering the country. This also means that addressing hate goes much farther than responding to specific incidents or comments. It requires an alternative narrative, one that, rather than one that feeds hate, shifting to a narrative that makes understanding and welcome the dominant story. If we're going to create a different environment, that is, reshape the narrative of our deeply polarized society, we need the moral imagination to begin. We need patience, effective tools, and community to sustain our courage. We need effective strategies for creating and sharing this alternative narrative, one grounded in the values of acceptance and love. Today's tools are intended to apply across various forms of oppression, racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and the like. We begin with the exploration of inspiring stories of communities that have shown tremendous moral courage and work to defy hate. We'll hear about communities responding to Islamophobia, the desire to address deep community concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement, and ways that schools have used restorative circles to teach tolerance, cultivate empathy, and develop mature responses to difference. From there, we'll move our conversation into a conversation amongst the panelists. We will not be offering a question and answer today during this webinar, but we do invite you to engage with the chat feature. On the bottom right of your Zoom screen, you'll see an icon that looks like a talk bubble. If you click that, a panel will open up and you can type your comments into the box there on the bottom. My colleague, Hannah Hafter, Senior Program Leader for Activism, will be monitoring our chat today. Our goal here is to offer you some concrete tools and techniques to use in your own communities to depolarize difficult conversations, defy hate, and embody a moral courage that places love at the center. We have a wonderful panel of guests today for our webinar, and I hope that today we have Catherine Orsborn, Campaign Director for Shoulder to Shoulder. We have Jake Morrill, the minister at the Oak Ridge Unitarian Universalist Church. He is also with Reverend Derrick Hammond, who's the pastor of the Oak Valley Baptist Church, and Chief James T. Akagi, who is the chief of police for the city of Oak Ridge. And we also have Dr. John Bailie, the president of the International Institute for Restorative Practices. So we're going to begin today with Catherine. And Catherine is going to share with us some stories about the work that she's been doing with Shoulder to Shoulder. Catherine, I'd like to begin with you. Catherine is the campaign director of Shoulder to Shoulder, a national campaign of religious and interfaith organizations dedicated to ending anti-Muslim bigotry in the United States. Catherine offers strategies and support to regional and local efforts combating discrimination against the Muslim faith and seeks to present a new story of interfaith engagement and solidarity that focuses on positive relationships across faith lines. We're glad to have you here, Catherine. Can you please tell us a little bit about Shoulder to Shoulder, and if you will, about how the climate of hate speech is impacting the people with whom you work?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be with y'all today. So just very briefly, Shoulder to Shoulder is a coalition of 34 religious denominations and faith-based organizations that came together in 2010 to say that across religious differences, we stand against anti-Muslim bigotry in this country as an affront to our own religious values and as an affront to our national ideals. So we work at the national and local levels to help educate, equip, network, and mobilize faith communities to stand up against anti-Muslim bigotry in its many forms, and to help people see that this is an American problem of concern for people of all faiths and of no faith at all, rather than a Muslim problem. So before I get into some stories of what people have been doing to counter the hateful narrative towards the American Muslim community that we've seen take root, I want to give a little framing for what Islamophobia looks like right now, how it's impacting the American Muslim community, concrete ways of thinking about something that is often kind of a big picture idea that a lot of people talk about. So one thing to note here is that rhetoric and violence against the American Muslim community is up. This is something we've heard anecdotally from our Muslim partners across the country, especially within the last year. And now we have some data that backs that up. A few weeks ago, the New York Times published a story citing research from California State University that shows that hate crimes against American Muslims are at their highest since immediately following 9/11. And a recent report from Georgetown University's Bridge Initiative shows that violence against Muslims has coincided with the particularly negative rhetoric infusing this year's elections. This violence shows up as hate crimes against individuals. It shows up in vandalism of places of worship or opposition of building new houses of worship, and of bullying of kids in schools, just to name a few of the many manifestations of this. People often think of this as a direct response to terrorism internationally or domestically. This, combined with the lack of education about Islam and Muslims, is a piece of the puzzle, but it's only a piece. Data from Gallup shows that acts of anti-Muslim bigotry actually correlate more closely with election years and with other political events in the US, as Paul mentioned at the beginning, rather than being a direct reaction to acts of violence perpetrated by people who are claiming to represent Islam. Additionally, there are anti-Muslim groups like Act for America, the Center for Security Policy, Refugee Resettlement Watch, which focuses on opposing refugees and especially opposing Syrian refugees right now. These groups are well organized and they're well funded, and they're helping to legitimize and mainstream voices that are speaking out against Islam and Muslims. So people who don't really have credentials but are put forward as experts on Islam or Muslims. So I recommend looking at the Center for New Community or the Southern Poverty Law Center. Both of those organizations have profiles on some of these groups and some of the different actors at play here. So I think it's really important to note that where this hate is coming from, it's a combination of a lot of things, but it's important to note the organized way that some of this is being legitimized. So all of this is combining with the lack of education, or I would say more like reverse education about Islam, and the lack of relationships that many Americans have with Muslims. A large percentage of Americans say they don't know a Muslim. And so this, with lack of education and the prevalence of both terrorism, but also the way terrorist acts perpetrated by people who identify themselves as Muslims are portrayed, as opposed to those perpetrated by, like, say, white Christian men. The media portrays those things very differently. And so all of that is combining to create this very toxic environment that we're seeing right now that results in a lot of violence. And the last thing I want to note here before moving into some of the ways we've seen folks pushing back is a report from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding that shows that anti-Muslim legislation is intertwined in very concrete ways with other types of legislation at the state level that target minorities or marginalized groups. So, like, laws to curtail voting rights are often overlapping with laws that are targeting Muslims through banning foreign law and that sort of thing. So how are groups and individuals pushing back against all of this? Because that's the story we want to be telling. First, I think it's important to note that American Muslim individuals and organizations have been doing a ton of work to counter false narratives and to build relationships with people of other faiths and backgrounds. But they can't do it by themselves. For one thing, the demographics just don't add up. Muslims are estimated to be about 1 to 2% of the population of America. And so to think that Muslims should take this on by themselves ignores that reality and the reality that American Muslims have busy lives like the rest of us. They're contributing to society in a number of different diverse ways. And additionally, Muslims in our country shouldn't have to carry the weight of fighting back these false narratives, contributing to the rise in anti-Muslim bigotry. I think that it's on all of us who care about preserving American inclusion, pluralism, equality, and justice to be working together to push back this tide. So here it's helpful to start by thinking about the various places and opportunities we have to push back. We have opportunities in conversations, whether those are in groups or one-on-one. We have opportunities through media, both traditional and new media, to be pushing back. We also have opportunities to put pressure on lawmakers and others with access to power or institutional change, particularly when we're dealing with legislation or with concrete steps that can be taken by people in power, and by coming alongside Muslims when we witness public acts of anti-Muslim bigotry. So there's a lot of ways in which we can raise our voices. But when we're lifting our voices, how are we doing this? Overall, we're really working to counter a narrative, not by doing a point-by-point debunking of a prevailing negative narrative, but really to offer an alternative narrative for people across the country to live into. So I want to just share 2 examples of alternative narratives we've seen lived out and embodied, particularly in this last year. So I don't know if folks were aware of the protests around the country, planned protests against mosques that were taking place in October of 2015. But there were over 20 protests planned across the United States of Islamic centers or Muslim community centers. And they were organized online. People were encouraging the protesters to come armed. And so what we were looking at was potentially large armed protests of houses of worship, specifically targeting the Muslim community across the nation. And so what we helped facilitate in some cases and witnessed happening in other cases is communities finding out about these, and we made sure that communities were aware that these were happening once they started to pick up steam in the media, coming together to come alongside their Muslim neighbors, asking the Islamic centers, connecting with them and asking them what sort of support they wanted, and then coming out in support. And my favorite case was in Amarillo, Texas, where we were able to connect some national media as well as local media to the folks there who were organizing. And over 100 people came out to support the Muslim community. So they weren't doing a counter protest, they were coming out in solidarity. And a lot of them had "Love Your Neighbor" t-shirts on and that sort of thing. And they, and then juxtaposed to them was one of the pictures that the news media captured. And it's not the one on the screen now, but there's some pictures you can find on the web covering this. But it was a picture of this crowd of over 100 people with these "Love Your Neighbor" t-shirts on. The Jewish community was out there on the Sabbath because it was a Saturday morning. And these folks were standing there juxtaposed with a couple of guys with a truck with a Confederate flag on the back and crude shirts on that said "F Islam" and toting guns. And there were two of them kind of standing on the side, and then this huge crowd of over 100 people standing together. And I think that was being able to help make sure that the news media captured that story was a really big part of shifting some of the narratives there. And I know I've heard stories of people building relationships from that event. The other one that coincides with the picture that's on your screen now is when there was graffiti on a mosque in Louisville, Kentucky. Instead of immediately cleaning up the graffiti, they actually waited a couple days and invited their interfaith network to come out to help physically repaint the mosque together, to really show their solidarity in public. And this is a picture from it. You can see a pretty large crowd, but this doesn't even show. It was like thousands of people that came out. The mayor came to speak, and they ended up blocking the highway, not intentionally, but because so many people were trying to get to the mosque to show their solidarity with the community by repainting it together. And I think that, you know, these are examples of when a very public incident of anti-Muslim bigotry happens. But I think that they show how this counter narrative can be lived out in many ways. And so I'll point to just 5 key things that I think we can all do in addressing Islamophobia when we see it. I think one huge piece is to connect with other people, with Muslims in particular, if you're able to do that in your community, to listen to the diverse voices of the American Muslim community. And if you can't listen by building those relationships in person, you can listen on social media. You can try to follow Muslims who are writing and speaking out on social media or on other platforms. There's plenty of those, and I'd be glad to connect you with resources if you'd like to be pointed to some different folks you might consider following to really try to hear what the American Muslim community is saying and what the experience is, which is diverse and experienced differently by different members of the American Muslim community, and to learn. The second is to amplify the voices of diverse American Muslims. So when you're listening and you're learning, you have the ability to amplify those voices and to be able to bring those narratives and arguments to other people. Speaking up and speaking out when you have the opportunity, and calling others in rather than calling others out. And I think this is something lots of us have been having conversations about. What does it look like to call people in to living a different narrative, into a different conversation that's honest and authentic, and focused around love and relationships. So we can call them into conversations. We can call people into relationship building or learning opportunities, and there are a lot of good resources for that. And then strategically organizing and pushing back when there are structural issues to push back against. So I'll stop talking now so that we have plenty of time to hear from the other folks, but I look forward to engaging in the Q&A a bit later.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. That was wonderful to hear from you. And the story about the congregation in Louisville is wonderful. I know that you can just barely see the graffiti at the top of the photo there that we showed earlier. I'll show it again later. But yeah, it's fascinating that the traffic was backed up in order for folks to get there. That's wonderful. Thank you. So we're going to just move on here. And next, I'd like to introduce to you our group from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, who've been working together across to address concerns raised by members of the community about Black Lives Matter issue, particularly related to racism in the schools and some of the policing practices in Oak Ridge. These three, along with a local Catholic priest, have come together to seek real community solutions. First, we have Reverend Jake Morrill, who has served as minister of the Oak Ridge Unitarian Universalist Congregation since 2003. Jake is a longtime student of family systems thinking, and currently he continues that interest through a postgraduate program at the Bowen Center for the Family in Georgetown, D.C. Pastoral conversations at the church with soldiers returning from Afghanistan and Iraq inspired Jake to become commissioned as a chaplain in the U.S. Army Reserve, where he holds the rank of captain. Along with him today, we have Police Chief James T. Akagi, who is a retired federal officer from the DEA and has been serving as chief of police in Oak Ridge for the last 5.5 years. And we also have Pastor Derrick Hammond of the Oak Valley Baptist Church. Reverend Hammond completed a dual master's degree program at Samford University, earning a Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Business Administration. He received numerous awards, including Biblical Language Scholar Award by Beeson Divinity School, and recognition as a National Recruitment Scholar for the Fund for Theological Education and the PhD Project. Gentlemen, it's good to have you here. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what motivated you to begin this dialogue, and how has it changed you both personally and professionally?
Thanks a lot, Paul. I think we're all blushing here around the table. I'll start us off. I'm Jake Morrill, the minister at the Oak Ridge UU Church. And in July 2015, after our denomination at its annual assembly voted to approve a position of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, we had leaders come back and ask the board of our congregation to similarly express solidarity with Black Lives Matter. The board approved that support, and one expression of that support was to put out on our electronic turnpike-facing sign the words Black Lives Matter. In August of 2015, there was a news cycle among some media outlets to characterize Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization and as a real menace, and anti-police, and the combination of our sign and that news coverage created an atmosphere in which, especially online, but also some walk-in visits and some phone calls here, began to be not just disagreeing, but hostile and even menacing. And I'd say that's when I found myself, in the picture of a polarized situation. I did not want to take down a sign because people were upset by it. At the same time, I was concerned for the safety of the congregation and not sure about a path forward. And that's when Chief Akagi, I really credit for reaching out, and Pastor Hammond convened a meeting. So I'll pass it to you all.
Yeah. It was, let me tell you, Pastor Hammond convened a meeting. I just showed up. I got to give credit where credit's due.
Oh, bless you. Well, essentially what we ended up doing at that point, we came together and we wanted to, as Reverend Jake has alluded to, we wanted to, with regards to the safety of his congregation, identify ways that we can bring the sign down, but doing it in a way that did not overlook the issues that got the sign put up in the first place. And so what we'd established that we would do to manage and maintain that balance is that they would take the sign down, and I'll step back to talk a little bit about kind of the role even Oak Valley had relative to the Black Lives Matter, because the UU church is a predominantly white church, and there are about 5 other African-American churches in the area, none of which were actively engaged in that effort to get the sign put up. And so that was a relative unique dynamic in and of itself in the area. But with that being said, we sought to, have the sign come down, that they stopped putting it up. But in an effort to make sure we identified or understood the issues that got the sign put up in the first place, we agreed to host and hold 3 community forums. I myself at Oak Valley Baptist Church, Jake here at the Unitarian Church, and then Father Shelton at St. Mary's Catholic Church. We did it across 3 different weekends on a Sunday, and we essentially opened up the microphone and we allowed people to share whatever they wanted to share. Whoever wanted to come to the microphone would have the opportunity to do that. Our commitment to the participants would be that we would take notes, to which Chief Akagi graciously had his administrative assistant come out, paid her overtime to come out and record the meticulous notes of all of the concerns that were shared. Our commitment was that we would take those notes, we would go through them, and we would strategically work together and form strategic partnerships as necessary to address those concerns, and we would do it over whatever time period it took. And we would use that as kind of our roadmap and our guide for working together. And so that was kind of what started the process. It started with a few people coming out, and then more people came out. We had the numbers here: 92 people came out to the first session, 127 came out to the second, and then 155 came out to the third. And so it renewed a number of conversations from a number of community partners in efforts of addressing these, just really based on working together in relationship and strategic partnerships.
If I could, from a law enforcement point of view, this just wasn't meeting with pastors or local ministers or reverends. It was a true partnership, and I think one of the key factors was, for us, we weren't here. We let people know we're not here to solve your problems. We're not here to fix anything. We're here to listen. We're here to start. And I think we acted more as facilitators, and we saw community members that are quite diverse. This is a community of just under 30,000 come together. That what started over really a sign, and to some it was a symbol of hope, and to others it was a symbol of hate and bigotry, and it really brought the community together in a way that I haven't seen in my 5.5 years. And you talk about a diverse congregation: Catholics, Baptists, Unitarians, and a police chief. It doesn't get any more diverse than that. And I think that was part of the secret. We weren't there to learn or to solve anything. We were there to listen and to learn and to kind of put people together. And I think that's what happened.
One of the things that I think I saw happening was not only the large group sessions where the public was invited to come, but the sort of hallway conversations that followed up there, and then small group conversations. One of the things that I heard more than once from people was that in the environment of the comment threads out in the community with Facebook groups and that kind of thing, it was sometimes hard for public officials, public leaders, community leaders to frankly engage complex subjects if they're going to say, yeah, this is something we're struggling with, and then get it sort of beat over the head with them. So I saw in small group conversations, one of the things that I saw happening was some agreement about the norms or almost covenant of that we weren't going to play gotcha, that we were going to take one another's positions and experiences seriously, and that we weren't going to be pushing an agenda in the context of this process, but instead trying together to work toward the truth, trying to work toward the good of our city and principles that we hold in common, equal justice under the law, a fair shake for all in the schools, everyone taking responsibility no matter their station and in the community. So it really took some time to do that and to really hear the different perspectives. When we're going to the schools and saying, hey, what's up with these discipline numbers? Well, that's not a surprise to them, and that educational professionals have a whole complex view on that and a story behind it, and understand wider systems of history and economic opportunity and housing that feed into discipline and academic achievement, which is not to say that the education system is not held accountable, but maybe to say that the whole community is held accountable for its part in a pretty complex situation.
Right. And relative to a couple of things I'll touch on is this, our approach. I know Catherine did a really good job. I appreciate that, by the way, how that's laid out. That follows a lot of the approach that we've taken. But just to kind of what we communicated and share with the community was that we would first work to identify the problems and concerns that they perceived were there. So we allow people to just share whatever it was, whether it was real or perceived. They were able to write it down, and we identify at least what they perceived the current concerns were. And then we said we would target those concerns. And part of the targeting process is which we told them we will follow up after. And that's, we would go get some statistics that would either substantiate those concerns or not. And then once we substantiated the concerns or not, the next step would be to address those concerns. And addressing them involved looking at what part, one, is it real? And if it's not real, how do we communicate the reality of where we are over and against the perception? And why is that gap there? Then the next thing, if it was perceived to be a problem, there were some statistics. The high school suspension data and suspension rates was one that was perceived and it was real. So we looked at who are some partners that we can effectively bring to the table in such a way that we can create win-win solutions for everyone. And the last one was actually resolving the community issues, which is identifying what it would take, taking the necessary steps, and then drawing some feedback and having some type of measurement to demonstrate the fact that those steps taken were successful. And we've done that in several of the different areas. A year later, we've got a report coming out here that's just saying, here were the concerns that were raised, and here are some substantial facts and data to demonstrate that some significant steps have been taken to that end.
Can you give an example, maybe one or two examples of some of the concrete things that have changed? And if you guys, and Jake and Jim, if you guys can move in a little bit, where people are saying they can't see you. Yeah, thank you. That's great.
It's a looking bunch in there.
Okay, the chief will now, he'll share a couple of things that he's working on, and I can hit a couple that we've looked at there at the high school.
I've got to tell you, I was very uneasy going into this. It's tough going into this, not knowing what to expect, and I had some perceptions myself. But one of the things that I was very pleased to hear was that, well, I was pleased to hear that people thought African Americans were being stopped more so than the population of Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge has about a 9.8% African American population. When we pulled the statistics over an 11-month period, we found it to be about 11.2% of all our stops were African Americans, which is close enough to where I'm happy with that. But what that really did for me was say to me in the department, we need to provide data. It's right in line with the President's 21st Century Policing models and recommendations, the 6-pillar plan. So one of the things we're doing at the police department is I'm currently working, I just was up at the White House listening with a bunch of other chiefs to some of the presentations. We're working to build on what we did here in Oak Ridge by putting not our statistics, our crime statistics, but our officer activity online. So the first step is to actually categorize our arrests by race, gender, and age, and put that online on a regular basis, whether it's monthly or quarterly or weekly. Then we want to move to traffic stops, and eventually our goal is to put all citizen contacts online so people could see who the police are contacting, how they're being resolved, and to be more transparent in how we do things. I'll tell you, with our staff, it was tough because they said, well, Chief, gosh, what if we find out we're not doing something right or we're stopping more? That's exactly what we want to find out. And it was these conversations that brought that forward along with the 21st Century Policing recommendations. So that's something that we're doing at the police department as a direct result of this. And it's conversations like this that we have with the community that really reinforces our commitment to be more transparent, which in turn hopefully is going to build some trust amongst our citizens.
Right, and that was a really good example where the perception was one way, and so even as an African-American pastor in the African-American community, it shifted the nature of my own conversations from not we need to go and get these statistics reduced to we actually need to communicate and understand why is that difference and that barrier there between the perception and the reality. So it shifted the nature of our conversations as well. The other concrete one that I'll look at, there are three global issues. We kind of categorized them. One was high school suspension and discipline rates, particularly relative to African Americans. The other one was high school stress rates. And the third one was community partnerships or the lack thereof between the school system and several, either the community or several organizations around them that they felt could benefit by a support of the school system. But one in particular was the African American suspension rates. That was one that was perceived and was actually accurate. It was found that African Americans were, I guess, it was about 6 times more likely to be suspended when you looked at the suspension rates. And when we looked at that, we worked with the principal, and what they did was they restructured their suspension matrix, and they implemented several intermediate steps from referral to actually out of school suspension. And they called them buffers. And so these intermediary steps included stuff like lunch, after school, Wednesday detentions, that kind of created these buffers. And at the end of the 2015 school year, this past year, they were at a 10-year low relative to their suspensions. There were 628 suspensions at the end of 2015. Whereas leading up to this year, the 4 years leading up to this year, respectively, were 1,012, 1,006, 892, and 895. So it went from those type numbers down to 628 by simply putting buffers in there between when they would get a referral and when they were being out of school suspended, because we found that other races, they might not have been so quick to have received an out of school suspension as maybe some of the African American community. So that was one area where it was a real perception. We took some very real steps working with the school superintendent and the principal, that he was able to implement them and have some demonstrated results. That's just one, but that's one of many examples of the type of work we were able to do.
Oh, that's great. Wow, that's terrific. So the strategic partnerships that you set up, it sounds like they've been effective and have made a difference in the community that you're working with. Great. Well, we'll come on back to this in a minute. I want to get to John, who's next. John Bailie. Dr. John Bailie is the president of the International Institute for Restorative Practices. And John is an experienced restorative conference facilitator in adult and juvenile cases, including those involving felony-level offenses. He spent many years as a counselor for troubled and at-risk youth at a community service foundation and Bucksmont Academy day treatment alternative school that operates according to restorative practices. Welcome, John. Can you tell us a little bit about what restorative practices are and how these practices can best be used to help teach children and youth how to more effectively manage conflict and difference?
Sure. Thanks, Reverend Paul, and good to meet everyone on the panel. So restorative practices, in brief, is a social science that studies how to build social capital and achieve social discipline through participatory learning and decision-making. The IIRP, we're a graduate school based in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in the United States. And we do a few things. Of course, we do graduate education. We're the first school to only offer degrees explicitly in restorative practices. But we also do a lot of professional development work around the country and overseas. In the U.S., we train about 13,000 people a year, and our primary customers in the professional development world are school districts, and particularly urban schools, and probably leaning a little more towards those schools who've experienced the most stress, particularly around some of the issues the Reverend's just talked about, racial disproportionality and discipline, some of the the most concerning figures around school climate, violence, and things like that. So what we teach to schools and to others, we also train criminal justice professionals, police, probation, and a wide variety of other people like Reverend Paul as well. We were students together many, many years ago. People who out doing a lot of the work that all of you have been talking about is really centered around the question of how do you get people to do the right thing? There's a lot of ways you can answer that question. What's legal, of course, is one way to do that. What you were taught growing up, of course, is one way to do that. But, on a real sort of day-to-day basis, why do most of us do the right thing most of the time? And we actually do this as an exercise in one of our trainings. And what most people will say, all those other things I just mentioned are certainly a part of that. But why most of us do the right thing most of the time is probably because of the relationships we have with the people around us. So to the extent that you feel bonded to, connected to the people closest to you, you're more likely to do what those people expect. So, we had a conversation before this meeting about even things like hate crimes, hate speech, things, behavior that we obviously want to minimize, send strong messages that it's not welcome in our communities. So the legal portion of that, yeah, that's important. That's not my particular field, but I think, those things are certainly important in society. But if you really want to ensure that people on a day-to-day basis are going to find minimal opportunities and minimal invitation to behave in ways we don't want them to behave, the best way to do that is to create a community that effectively resists that type of behavior, has really concrete ways on a person-to-person basis. People have the skills when they see behavior that doesn't match what the community expects. They know how to confront that person in a way that, again, draws people in instead of just pushing them away. But at the same time, send strong messages about what's okay and what's not. So we have a shorthand way of saying of what restorative practice is in a nutshell is that people will do best, people are most effective, they're more likely to be disciplined in their behavior towards others when people in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. So the with restorative approach stands out in pretty strong contrast to, if you think about, if I have a group of people, whether I'm dealing with a school or a family or a community, how do I get people to do the things that we want them to do that are in the community's best interest? Well, I could threaten them into doing the right thing and threaten consequences, and that certainly plays some role in getting people to do what you want them to do. But if that's our sole approach, threats and intimidation and coercion, that generally has diminishing returns over time. We all know there are lots of things that are illegal that doesn't necessarily change people's behavior by itself. Or, on the other hand, you could say, well, if we just provided people with enough love, caring, and support, they'll behave the way we want them to. And, well, care and support is important, but at the same time, I think you can think of many situations where loving and caring is not enough. You also have to say, you need to knock it off. That needs to stop. And people do need to understand that there are consequences for behaving in a way that's not healthy. But the restorative approach really it's the best of both worlds, is that you're going to be at your most effective, whether you're talking about a congregation, a school who wants good, healthy behavior from children, or a community where you want really pro-social, healthy civil behavior, is provide really strong limits in terms of setting strong messages about the kind of behavior that's acceptable and what's not acceptable, but also providing a lot of support, that especially for those community members among us whose views and behavior we find most odious, assuming they're not going to move or we're not going to incarcerate them, it means we're still going to be living with them at the end of the day. We might not get to choose everything they think. We might not get to fundamentally shift their entire worldview. But if we want them to live and function better within our community or to stop harming people, that's going to be a lot more effective when we do the much more difficult work of saying there needs to be a real human encounter here. When I think about the stories that Catherine told, what Reverend Morrill and Reverend Hammond told, the Chief told, the messaging was certainly important about there was implied values or stated values in the stories that you told of, this is what this community believes. We feel strongly about these things. But just saying those messages is not enough. And, putting it on the billboard at church is by itself important, but not enough. Stating it in the flyer that we pass around, that's important, but not enough. What I heard in the stories that really changed the people who were open to change. And, you can't necessarily change everyone, but for those who were changeable, at least in the short term, it was the personal encounter and the willingness to sit down and say, look, I can't necessarily change your religious views. I can't necessarily change your social views, but I think most people, when put in a structured situation where there are some guidelines like the chief talked about, look, if I'm going to show some vulnerability, I need some assurances, right, of how this is going to go. And there needs to be a plan as to how this conversation is going to unfold. But if you give people those opportunities, unexpected things typically do happen. And what I usually say to people with restorative practices is, look, I can't guarantee everything that someone's going to think and believe after this encounter or after several of these meetings, but what I will pretty reliably guarantee is that they're going to walk out of the room much more likely to see each other as human beings and to modify their behavior very carefully in the future. And not just because we threaten them with consequences, but because they realize this person that was an other to me, I might not still fully understand them or share their life story, but I see him as a human being now. I kind of get it. And I think the really positive aspect of restorative practices is it really does call out to what's best in human beings, is that people do fundamentally want to be well thought of themselves. Most people at heart aren't seeking to ruin relationships in the places where they live. They're usually afraid. They might be facing bad information, like I think the Reverend's talked about in some cases. And in a lot of cases, you got justifiable anger on both sides. It just needs to be talked through and expressed. A lot of the worst behaviors occur sometimes because people haven't, frankly, had a healthy venue to talk about pain and their story, their personal experience, and whatnot. So a quick story that'll illustrate some of the concepts. A school I was working in, this was an alternative school for teens that had either been arrested, been in trouble with the law, some of whom had been facing drug and alcohol issues. This is a good photo to leave up. Some of whom had been facing drug and alcohol issues in their life, or they had trouble at home. So most of the children, young people, were about 13 to 18 years old. There was one young woman who I was working with. It's not funny. It wasn't funny at the time. People start streaming into my office one by one, different students. It's a very racially, culturally diverse school, saying, Mr. John, we have to do something. I said, okay, what's that? I'm thinking there was a fight or something else. So it turns out this young woman is walking down the hallways with swastikas magic markered onto the front of her hands. So we at least did one smart thing, and then we did a bunch of stupid things. The one smart thing we did was we went and found her and made her stop walking the hallways with swastikas on her hands, and got her separated from everybody else. And now this was a school who had done a lot of things like circles, which are just structured or semi-structured ways to have conversations with groups where students have a chance to talk about norms for behavior. They have a chance to build relationships, get to know one another, and we also use them to deal with conflict with one another. So make a long story short, some of the intervening issues with this young woman is, and not all of the students knew this, she had serious cognitive and emotional issues. She was about 15 years old, but emotionally she was probably about 7 on a really definitive scale. And she was very limited in some of her thinking. But of course, that doesn't really matter to someone who just thought they saw, a skinhead walking down the hallway. So we tried to address the trauma this had caused people numerous times without pulling together a circle. And I think this was a mistake that we made. At first I think we felt like we both wanted to protect this young woman with cognitive difficulties, because We were convinced she didn't fully understand the ramifications or the symbolism of even what she had done, but obviously she was wanting some sort of attention. And on the other hand, we had a brewing racial tension that we were afraid would boil over. We made two really poor, incorrect attempts to kind of try and make this go away before we realized, look, we just have to put everyone together and we all need to talk. So we had a meeting where we arranged everyone in a circle with a little bit of preparation. And we basically followed the format of, there's a slide that Reverend Paul will show you with what we call restorative questions, where people had a chance to answer the following questions. What happened? What were you thinking about at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected by what you have done? And this was asked to the young woman, obviously, not to everybody else. How were they affected? What do you think you need to do in order to make things right? And everyone else got a chance to answer, what did you think when you realized what had happened? What impact has this incident had on you and had on others? What's been the hardest thing for you? And what do you think needs to happen in order to make things right? And what played out, and there's, you can't guarantee exactly everything everyone's going to say, but having a simple structure like this, and this is something we teach in our courses and in our trainings, having a simple structure like this makes what can be a very fearful conversation for everybody a little more emotionally safe. People talked about things like, hey, look, I don't know what you meant, but you have swastikas on your hands. I came from a school where I got beat up on a regular basis because I was Hispanic. Or one student actually shared, as soon as I saw that, all I could think about was he had a grandfather who was lynched. He's from the Deep South. It brought up all of that for him. It brought up all sorts of things. Staff talked about, got honest, and actually at some point even talked about saying, look, I feel really badly. I feel like I didn't handle it right. We kind of tried to make this go away because on one hand, we were trying to sort of protect everybody, but protecting everybody from each other was the wrong thing to do. What they needed to do was actually have a face-to-face encounter. The young woman got a chance to say in her own way, and I think people got a better understanding of who she was. She answered the questions, but her cognitive limitations were so obvious that it didn't mean that it was okay what she did. But several students actually said, look, after hearing you speak, look, I get it. You probably don't fully understand what you did, but I'm telling you right now, don't you ever do that again. And that was exactly what needed to happen. So it all worked out, I think, as best that it could. The difference of what typically would have happened in a typical school is she would have been accused of a hate crime, justifiably so, as the way most of those regs are written. She probably would have been removed. The school would have been left feeling like there's some sort of underground of white supremacy going on that nobody knew about. And then the staff would have to be dealing with ramifications and bits and pieces. But because we had a group way to deal with it and a structure for it, that treated everyone with respect, including a young woman with serious cognitive issues. It wasn't right for us to treat her like she can't speak for herself. We had a radically different outcome. And the most important thing was the community ultimately set some very strong messages about what kind of behavior is acceptable and what kind of behavior is not, and the way we're going to respond to it when it does happen. And we didn't have to formally punish anybody because the group handled it themselves. So do you want me to cover the last slide?
Well, or I could.
Yeah,
say,
go ahead.
So it seems like, so part of what we're doing when we're working to defy hate and to sort of depolarize the kind of stress that we're experiencing in our society is to begin to work with people rather than doing things for them or to them, which I think, excuse me, which happens a lot. There's well-meaning people who say, here, let me come in and fix this for you, as the chief said earlier. And that's not always the best way to do it. Sometimes we have to sit in the discomfort and just have the conversation and really work with that. I think, being curious and asking questions and not just sort of asking questions and then preparing our answer, but actually listening to what people have to say is important. And certainly working within circles, anytime we can kind of round things out and bring everyone into the conversation, as you've all talked about, is really important. And the restorative questions and the restorative approach are techniques for doing that. So, Thank you, John. That was really very helpful. So one of the questions that I had, and this goes back to something, Catherine, that you talked about. We talk. I hear a lot about people saying, well, we shouldn't count on people of color or transgender people or people with a particularly marginalized identity to be our educators. That we really should be doing the education ourselves and learning about this stuff on our own. I wonder if Catherine, maybe you can talk a little bit about places people can go. I know that you have lots of information about places where people can go to get information about Islam. And I will also add that, I did a quick search on Islam a couple of weeks ago, and the first couple of pages that came up on the Google search were less than helpful. They were almost all sort of negative sites that were anti-Islam, anti-Muslim. And so I wonder if there's some keywords or phrases or places we can go to really get the kind of information that will help us learn, so that we don't have to rely on those communities to teach us.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I'm just pulling up a couple of things to paste into the chat box to share with folks as some good starting places. But yeah, I mean, that's true that when you do a Google search, this is not a topic where you can expect to find, there's not very many topics where you can expect to find objective results, but this one is one where particularly there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. And so there's a lot of negative and frankly false and well documented sort of sources out there. So I'm going to share a couple here that I think are good places to look for some information. And then, so I'll just name those and then we'll paste them in the box in a moment because I'm bad at typing and talking at the same time. But ING, Islamic Networks Group, is it's an organization based in the US, based in California, very explicitly focused on educating non-Muslims about Islam, cultural literacy, essentially around Islam. So they're a great resource. Karama is a great resource, particularly when asking questions around women in Islam and those sorts of issues, and around Sharia. It's a Muslim women's lawyer group, and they don't just focus on quote unquote women's issues. They focus on all sorts of things, but they do have a specific emphasis there. And then the other is a document that a number of different groups work together to put together called "What is the Truth About American Islam?" And it's a shorter document with kind of like pithier answers to certain things, but with links to other resources and that sort of thing. So I'll share those three things as good resources. And as far as, not asking American Muslims to educate us about what's going on, I think it's a little bit of both. In certain ways, I think there are lots of things we can do to, if you're not Muslim, to educate yourself about Islam and American Muslims with good resources, and to follow various American Muslims on Twitter, on Facebook. It's a very active community on social media, so there's lots of stuff you can learn just by listening and not asking them to give you a lot of their time. But at the same time, when you're doing a panel specifically on Islam, then you should have a Muslim who's part of that conversation, not speaking for Islam, but speaking for themselves as one perspective from the American Muslim community. And so there's a lot to think through there, but I know that there are many Muslims, especially if they are in roles like educational sorts of roles, that are very willing. And I'll just also note that ING, Islamic Networks Group, that I'm going to paste here, has a speakers bureau around the US as well. And we can typically connect people with folks as well.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you. Jake and company there. I wonder if you gentlemen can say a little bit about how the communities responded to the work that you've done, and how the community has either supported or not supported you in your efforts. You're muted there, Jake. There you go.
Yeah, I would characterize it as overall very positive. I think that Derrick and I, since the spring, have been engaged with the Kettering Foundation in their project for promoting democratic processes and engaging a participatory community and public civic life. If that is the intent of engagement and collaboration and working across sectors and backgrounds and perspectives, then it does mean on all sides surrendering some piece of agenda or some initial viewpoint that you started out with. For me, that has been constructive and a learning and growing experience. For others, and I would imagine this is true on all sides, that would be seen as a compromise or a loss of integrity to engage in conversation and process with people. So I would bet that there are probably people in Oak Ridge who are critical of all three of us, and the people that we've worked with and talked with for even engaging with each other. But generally I'd say that this was welcomed as a helpful, constructive framework for getting new conversations going.
Right, I would agree. We had several people even now who what they would echo is they had certain desires to plug in, but they weren't sure how to do it or who to talk to do it. And so in many ways, we've become conduits for people who will connect, and then we just kind of channel to some effort that's doing it. It's a lot of just individual people who are coming together to work on specific, concerns that are relative to them. I think if I had to say there was any significant pushback, I don't want to say pushback, but if there was any significant concerns, and they were expressed in the in the forum conversations, and that is these really aren't going to come to anything. I know that was my own challenge, being very honest, with the African American community. When I said I'm going to partner with these folks, they were like, you know what, we heard that. Nothing is going to come of that, that type of dynamic. And so we had to operate for a minute or two with a lack of what I would call global credibility, but people were willing to share. It gave them hope. And one of the biggest initial expressions was, we hope this doesn't stop like some of the other things have done. We hope this doesn't fall to naught. We hope that there are some results that come out of that. And the results, similar to what we spoke of a little bit earlier, has fueled that credibility, if you will. And so now we've got multiple conversations just kind of going on across the community. And we're seeing some significant advances at several levels and in several ways.
I have to tell you, I had a lot of pushback from my own department. I had a lot of pushback from officers, tenured officers here. I've been here 5.5 years. I came in as a chief. And I had a lot of officers tell me, well, you aren't from around here, and you partnering with a bunch of ministers, we've seen this before. And I got to tell you, the biggest amount of pushback I had was from my own team. Now the cool thing was I just could bring them along with me, and they came with me. And some of them actually bought in, but it's been a real learning experience for the police department, and it's really been transformative in seeing some of these people that were staunchly against partnering with the communities. I mean, our job's to police. It's not to partner with anybody. But to have them come around and say, well, we really do need to partner, and we really do need to evolve as an organization. And that's the neat part when we see our people get it. Career law enforcement, that we're not stupid, but we are hard-headed. That's how I like to put it. And to see this transformative way of thinking come about because we go to meetings or we participate in conversations to the point to where we're now trying to make real differences in how transparent we are in the community for the first time in the history of this police department. That's something that although it's not easy, it's very rewarding. And I welcome the pushback from my people because it gives us a chance to talk about things that are important and to be a model for other police agencies in the area. I've learned just as much from my partner agencies as they've learned from this experience, but it wasn't an easy road to get here, I'll say that.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. John, quickly, if you could just give us, one of the things I'm curious about is, you've been doing this restorative practices for a long time. I wonder if you can just talk really briefly, like a minute, about some of the sort of long-term impact that you've seen. Have you seen the students that have gone through this process of learning restorative circles and all of that? Have you seen any kind of evidence, kind of long-term evidence that's been a helpful and useful process for them, just in terms of their engagement in communities and their ability to sort of manage conflict more effectively?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, as with anything, there's no panaceas, and most things really worth doing are never easy. So, but the really hopeful things that we found, and we've been able to replicate it, not just us, of course, but the people that we work with, schools and whatnot. So in the U.S. in particular, and if you go to our website, you can look at the data and see some of the stories. Maybe even a school district close to you has already done or is doing restorative practices. The reliable effects, when we work with a school, what we try to focus most on is whole school climate change, meaning everyone who has contact with children, not just a few people who do specialized interventions. But if you want to change the way a community feels, you need to, we've always had the philosophy, you need to work with the entire community. That's longer, it's more challenging. It means getting people who don't necessarily come to you saying, I'd like the way I deal with relationships changed. Getting them to change, which requires the pressure of, say, a lot of their own colleagues. A training by itself doesn't change that. It's something that changes over time. So what we see reliably, frequently having or decreasing by at least a third or more suspensions, expulsions, dramatic reductions in incidents of violence. A big part of what we do, probably the majority of what we do when we work with a school system or a large school building, is proactive. We focus on relationship building, not just responses to wrongdoing. If you want less crime, and similarly, if you want less misbehavior, you can't just respond differently to it when it occurs. You have to increase the things that make it less likely to occur, which is the more people know one another, the more personal encounters they've had with each other, the more they've practiced communicating with one another, so it doesn't have to go to fists or cursing and screaming. That takes practice. You have to learn those are skills that it takes time and practice to learn. And we train staff to help kids learn how to do that. Frankly, we also help staff to learn how to do that with one another. Probably the hardest thing to change when we work with a school is because we also work with adult to adult relationships and leadership to staff relationships. You have to model in those relationships the behavior you want to see in the young people. So we frequently see those dramatic reductions in suspensions, expulsions, violence. We have three randomized control studies right now, one being done by Johns Hopkins, two others being done by the RAND Corporation with grants from the National Institutes of Health and Department of Education, looking into a lot of the other impacts we've seen as increased attendance, increased academic performance, increased pro-social factors, decreased risk factors, less likelihood to feel alone, depressed, hurt themselves, abuse drugs and alcohol, in environments where that's done intensively. Because you would expect, just like in a family that has leaders and adult role models that model strong personal relationships, confront misbehavior, but do it in a way that's also caring, and provide an intensive environment of nurturing, but also strong mentoring, you would expect to see the same social outcome in their children. And it's the same thing with a school or a community. If you want a community with less violence, with less drug use, with adults just treating one another civilly, if you have questions about the local mosque, you don't get in your pickup truck with your AR-15. So there obviously have some concerns. So how do you teach people the skills for, I want to go, I have some questions for the imam. How would I go have that conversation? If we want a real deep change, to doing the hard work of thinking what skills were those two men missing, including being told, don't act like an idiot. You can't do that anymore. You know what I mean? Whatever you were trying to get across, if you were just trying to gain attention, mission accomplished. But all the attention is frankly on you. So if you want to help people actually have that conversation, frequently people actually are missing the skills they need, and that's why they do incredibly outrageous, hurtful, harmful things. So those are some of the effects that we see, and I think we'll also see from some of the research, we'll have much more verifiable results around improved cognitive performance, progress towards graduation. Children don't tend to learn well in an environment that feels heavily coerced. And I think, the reality is, just like when I work with criminal justice, in the criminal justice world, prisons need to exist. There are people who need to be incarcerated. But I want to make sure that that's as few people as possible, because most people are frankly going to do better if we can have them enmeshed in a community setting that is invested in ensuring their health and their good behavior. So same thing in a school. If at all possible, I want the child in school, in a classroom, they're doing what we want them doing, and not over-reliance on force to deal with behavior we don't like. So,
thank you, John. That's helpful. We are rapidly running out of time here. I want to just quickly touch on a few resources for you all as you're out there in viewer land there. UUSC does offer some resources that are available. The first one that I offer you here is a We Who Defy Hate curriculum. It was actually put together by the Unitarian Universalist Association in Meadville, Lombard. And that can be found on the uua.org website. We have a few sites here that you can get some more information about Black Lives Matter movement and some of the things that they're working on. UUSC has a Building Bridges, Refugee Support and Advocacy Toolkit, which can provide you with all kinds of opportunities and resources for your community and your congregation or other groups to engage more effectively with refugees. And some other things you can do, please sign on to UUSC's current action to tell Congress to stand up against anti-immigrant rhetoric by hate groups. So that if you go to that website there, you can sign on to that. And also, we invite you to join in solidarity with the mothers who are at the Berks Family Detention Center. Many of them have been there for over a year. They're not supposed to be held for more than about 20 days, and they're there seeking freedom and asylum. So we encourage you to take a moment to sign on to those if you're so inclined. And just to sort of wrap up, I think there's a few kind of key things here that I heard throughout the course of this event here. I think the most important thing that we can do is to just be courageous and connect with one another and begin the conversation, which means that we just have to reach out to those people we're not quite sure how to do that. I think if we just reach out, like the same way that Jake and Derrick reached out to the police and invited the conversation. And Chief, it's wonderful that you were open to that conversation and willing to engage. I think that also includes understanding that the stories that frame our national conversation are stories that are not supporting the kinds of narrative that I hope that are grounded in love and in hope. And so we need to begin to amplify those voices of the people on the margins, the Muslim community, folks in the communities of color, LGBT communities, places like that. Supporting and cultivating empathy in our children and youth is the best way for any of us to be able to sort of shift the way our culture is operating and to change the way that we engage with one another, at least in the future. Be curious, ask questions, listen to the answers. And I think the most important thing about that is to just know that sometimes a different perspective can really open us up in new ways, and being open to those different perspectives are really pretty vital if we want to change the narrative that we're dealing with. And last but not least, engage in strategic organizing, pushing back on structural issues and really beginning to engage in the conversation. I think the police chief, you guys down in Oak Ridge there, the work that you did around sort of open conversations and really engaging people to come in and join you in the conversation, and then creating some strategic partnerships around that were really important. So I appreciate your telling us the story about that. It's really quite wonderful. So I want to just thank you all for joining us. We know that we've run a little long here, and I appreciate your staying with us. I'd like to have special thanks to Hannah and Pam in our Justice Building unit, and to Shayna and Cameron, our communications and tech crew. To our guests, Catherine, Jake, James, Derrick, and John, thank you all so much for joining us today. And thank you all to those of you who are joining us out there in the participant land. We're very glad you could join us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.